All right, so we'll get started. I just want to say good afternoon, everyone. I'm Debbie Singizer, and I'm the Director of Board Services at the Vermont School Boards Association. I am delighted that you have joined us today to learn more about this very important topic, the role of the board in student achievement. Before we begin, I would just like to take this opportunity to recognize all of the board members who are with us today. February is School Board Appreciation Month in Vermont. And in recognition of the nearly 900 school board members in Vermont who work tirelessly to serve as the trustees of the state's public education system, on behalf of the VSBA, I would like to say thank you. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your dedication. And thank you for your countless hours of volunteer service on behalf of our communities and students. What you do does make a difference. So thank you. So let's get started. I am honored to be joined by three other presenters, all of whom have in-depth experience and knowledge with our topic. Phil Gore is the Chief Learning Officer from the Idaho School Boards Association. Nick Caruso is the Associate Executive Director for Field Services and Technology at the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education. And Renee Sanchez is the Superintendent of the Rutland Northeast Supervisory Union. Phil and Nick are my professional mentors. Between the two of them, they probably have more than 50 years of experience working with school boards and doing research in educational governance. Phil has worked for state school board associations in Washington, Texas, Vermont, and is now living and working in Idaho. He has both written and edited several books, including Improving School Board Effectiveness, a Balanced Governance Approach. Phil is finishing up another book later this month called Confessions of a School Board Member, What Every Superintendent Needs to Know. Nick has been with the Connecticut Association of Boards of Education for 31 years, and he's served 10 years as a school board member himself. Nick has conducted more than, get this, 1,600 school board trainings during his career. You can see why these guys are my mentors. Renee Sanchez was recently hired as the permanent superintendent of the Rutland Northeast Supervisory Union after serving as our interim superintendent since July. Prior to joining RNESU, Renee was superintendent of the Champlain Valley School District. And before that, he was the assistant superintendent of operations in South Bend, Indiana, and a secondary school principal in Houston and Austin, Texas. And I say our superintendent at RNESU deliberately because the Barstow Unified Union School District, of which I am the chair, is part of the RNESU along with the Otter Valley Unified Union School District. Since his time with us, Renee has proven to be a team player, student results driven, and very community minded. We are lucky to have him on our governance team. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Debbie.
So before I hand it over to our presenters, I just want to provide a little bit of context. Here you see a simple diagram that is taken from a resource guide that was created by a team of 5 executive directors of state school boards associations from around the country. They wrote a guide in 2023 to assist school boards in their governance role, and it's called The Power of Positive Governance. As school boards, we aspire to be at the top of this pyramid in that dark green part, which is called positive governance. In Vermont, we frequently use the term good governance to describe where we wish to function as a school board. But what we really mean is more along the lines of positive governance as described here. During your school board tenure, you might hear this desired state called things like effective governance or balanced governance. But regardless of the descriptor, good, positive, effective, balanced, what really matters, I think, is the description of the state of governance, which here means all of the attributes that are listed under good governance, which is found in that lighter green part, plus being civil, polite, able to overcome anger and lost votes with the highest level of trust and understanding, a unified vision that drives board decisions, and outside board meeting actions or behaviors that reflect those that we use inside our board meetings. So the question is, how do we get to this desired state of good, positive, effective, or balanced governance? Does school board's work really affect student achievement? And if so, how? Do school boards even really matter? So that is what we will discuss for the rest of our time together. And I would like to turn it over to Phil and ask him this very simple question, Phil. Do school boards matter to student success? And if so, how do we know this?
Thank you, Debbie. Emerging research since the early 1990s has showed a strong connection between what school boards do in the boardroom and the likelihood that student achievement is improving in a classroom. Starting in the early 90s, researchers were looking at potential harm that school boards can cause when they become a distraction or create drama for the system. I think very important to that graphic you were just sharing on positive governance, there has to be a willingness and a commitment to work together. People can't be creating drama in the boardroom or outside of the boardroom and frankly, not become a distraction. What we see is that if teachers are talking about what happened in the boardroom last night, usually that's not a good thing. That's a distraction from them being focused on teaching for the day. While a lot of scholars and academics have wanted to believe that school boards don't matter at all, they finally had to relent and to notice that school boards do have an effect on student achievement. In fact, one of those groups, a think tank out of the DC area, the Fordham Institute, they finally came around about 11 years ago and had a paper they published where they included the fact that board members can influence achievement, even loosely, merits much more attention. Surely by scholars, but also by voters, parents, taxpayers, and other policymakers. Well, let's make sure we underscore school board members when we think about other policymakers. As the quote on the screen shows from the book, Improving School Board Effectiveness, A Balanced Governance Approach, I want to mention that Nick was one of the contributing authors to that book. About 10 years ago now, we published this, and it was a culmination of the research that existed that showed a connection between what school boards do and student outcomes in the classroom. And I think this quote by my co-editor, Tom, is really valuable because essentially, if the structures and norms of behavior within a school system positively affect instructional practices, improved student achievement is expected and typical. So it's about norms of behavior and structures. I might say board operating protocols and then policies, processes. And I would, before we move on, really underscore the essential element of governance priorities. If superintendents, administrators, teachers, staff, if the system is not aware of what the board's priorities are, if the board hasn't even discussed those, then you're really kind of on a trajectory to nowhere, right? If you're failing to plan, you're planning to fail, as one of our founding people said in the US. So really a lot of the research, Debbie, does come down to those three critical areas of what are our governance priorities? Are they clear? Are they collaboratively developed? Are they specific enough? And we'll come back around before the end of the webinar to talk about the importance of them being collaboratively developed. That means students, teachers, staff, community members, parents, families are all involved in identifying, contributing what the vision and values are for the school system. When the board has written agreements for how it does its work together and holds itself accountable to those, and when they have clear, transparent, consistent, and I might add, predictable processes student achievement is likely to be improving.
If I could just jump in for a second, folks should know that your book on balanced governance, I periodically throughout the year, I will help some of the instructors that teach the certification courses for incoming superintendents, the 093 certification here in Connecticut. And your book is often used in those classes as a guidebook, one of their textbooks along the way. It's very highly thought of.
Yeah, we had intended that, Nick, when we put it together, we were thinking it would be a great book study for boards to go through. And so far, across the country, it's maybe a little too academic for lay citizens, the average lay citizen to really dig into. But we have found it to be the case that it's helping out a lot in the preparation of superintendents and even other administrators to recognize and respect the proper role of the school board.
I'll just hold up my copy of it so people can see what it looks like if you want to find it on Amazon.
Chapter 1 in that book was written by the late Mary Della Gardell. She was a school board member in one district and a principal in another. And Mary simply posed the question to her professor one day in a doctoral program, if school boards could cause so much harm, couldn't they also do good? And out of that began to flow what we knew as a multi-state, multi-year Iowa Lighthouse research study. And we always kind of scoffed that there aren't lighthouses in Iowa, but Nick pointed out recently to me they do have two somewhere on a lake. But that idea that what are the shining examples of school boards and districts across the country that are really shining the light for others? If we could go to that next slide, these are kind of 5 principles. I'm sorry, I was on maybe the very next slide. We'll just jump right into this. The setting clear expectations, creating conditions for success, holding the system accountable, building public will, and boards learning together. Nick and I were in this project together in our respective states. I was working in Washington at the time and Nick in Connecticut. And it was a really powerful experience. Nick, do you want to jump in and maybe just talk a little bit more about our experiences with the Lighthouse?
So it's funny because I had been to a couple national conventions and Mary Della Gardell was talking about the research at that time because it started as a research project and then they started to make it practical in terms of actually applying what they learned to helping boards get better. And she was doing workshops on it pretty much annually. And I'd come back from, wherever it was and go to my executive director. We've got to get into this training. It's amazing stuff. But because there was a lot of work being done, there was a cost to buy in, and it took us a while to convince we convinced the state of Connecticut. The State Department of Education funded our participation in it for a number of years. And it's one of those things that you find yourself feeling very fortunate that you were just at the right time in the right place to participate in this because and frankly, as the state has moved on to new ideas and new initiatives, this is somewhat fallen by the wayside, although it's changed the way I teach boards, I work with boards and help boards. But the idea that you can there are specific conditions that exist in highly effective school districts, and there's a set of expectations of boards in those districts that are different than those in districts that aren't as successful. And they did a very intense research study to come up with that. And these 5 roles of the board that you see in front of you really is the basis of a lot of the work we still do with boards, setting clear expectations. I'll talk a little bit about this more later, but the idea, I never use the word vision or goals or expectations without the word clear in front of it, because far too often a goal could be interpreted. If you have 9 board members, that's typical in Connecticut. Vermont, I don't know whether you're a little smaller or a little larger. We go up to, I think, 13 in one. But if your goals aren't clear, you might have 12 different interpretations of what that goal means. And so the poor superintendent who's trying to develop a plan of action to resolve the problem is only going to get 1 or 2 board members happy because everyone else thinks it's a different problem. So clear expectations goes beyond just setting a goal, but really clearly identifying that we all mean the same thing. And likewise, the board, well, I won't get into Phil's stuff. I'll let you move along. But just in terms of the synergy and the energy, boards that went through Lighthouse training intensely, because the classic model was like a 3-year, once a month, very intensive program. And we definitely changed those boards forever. I mean, the cultures that existed 10 years ago still seem to exist in most of those districts because it was really that monumental a change. And the districts that used to be those troublesome ones that Phil mentioned before have become real leaders in terms of, putting achievement on the map in those towns.
And so Nick and Phil, if I could fill in just really quick here, kind of tying the two things together. So earlier, Phil, I really like the inspiration for the book because it was something that I was thinking about as well, is that the board is going to influence achievement either through action or inaction. So that's one step. And then the other piece is that whether, and Nick, this goes along with what you were saying, is that the expectations may be muddled, but they are clear to the extent that what your staffing looks like, what the budget looks like, and what you're supposed to dedicate your time, those are setting clear expectations as well from the board. And that's where it can get confusing, is that if those three things are not aligned to student success, you end up spending time there, taking you away from being able to focus on student success.
With Superintendent Sanchez here, I just want to underscore how critical it is that board-superintendent relationship and boards and superintendents being on a similar page. One of the things I've learned over the last 20 years is that boards and their individual members can have all different kinds of ideas, perspectives, opinions. Probably the best piece of advice I've ever heard given, passed on for superintendents, especially new ones, is learning to ask, is this the will of the board? Right? So, and I know Vermont has, boards, Nick, that are 15 and maybe even more members on the board. You've got all these different people, and they can all be pressuring the superintendent or other school administrators to say, we need to do this, we need to do that. Ultimately, only the board has authority to provide direction, governance, and oversight. And it's intriguing to me that the same skills that it takes to set clear expectations, kind of the same skills it takes to build and maintain trust between a board and superintendent, between the board and the community. It's that clarity and really coming to consensus. Probably can't emphasize how important it is for the board to come together with a clear one voice, right? Getting to that sense, as you said, a clear vision, so that the superintendent and others can run with the vision.
I wanted to put this up on the screen because I really like this equation. This is Nick's work. Nick, can you speak to us a little bit about this equation and what it means?
Certainly. Well, as a sort of an introduction to it, I was working with the board several years ago, and I was there to help one board member become a better part of the team. Let's just put it that way. And she was challenged. She was frustrated because she felt she wasn't being heard. But at one point she said something like, I don't trust anybody on this board. And so well, how does this work? How does somebody work collaboratively if you don't trust them? And I didn't get a clear answer that night, but I went back and I read a whole bunch of books on trust because I want to figure it out. And if I can figure it out, I'm going to write my book and I'm going to go on Oprah and make a lot of money and maybe retire to go trout fishing in Idaho. But what I did find was there's a lot of very poorly written books on trust, and a couple good ones. But one book, which 99% baloney, but the author did mention that it's transactional, that if certain things exist, then you should have trust. And so I played around with some things I picked up in the book. And basically, when I work with a board that has dysfunction and trust is part of that, I break this equation out and I say, all right, if we have that clear vision, if we really have articulated well what our expectations are, and if the administrative team has put together an action plan that truly meets those expectations, we know that if we implement this program, that we will have results. I mean, that has to exist. And if you have results, then you should have trust. And so when there's a lack of trust, we go back and say, all right, is there a clear vision? That's usually where the stumbling block is. It's either not articulated well, or we wrote them, they're on the wall, but we never look at them. We don't spend time talking about our goals at board meetings. Quick little advice, best thing you can do for cost of nothing, put report on goals on every agenda. Maybe it's part of the superintendent's report. Maybe it's a separate item. It's not meant to be a 45-minute presentation at every board meeting going over the goals. It might be just a 10-second plug for item 3 on the agenda tonight is directly related to goal 1. Or next month, we're going to talk about goal 2 with a new program we're going to recommend to initiate. Or we're going to give you a report on that reading program we put in as part of goal 1 last year. So, but if you do all that, and then you get the results, that's great. If not, does the plan align, or does the superintendent, maybe they're doing, the work's being done, but do we see the interaction and how it relates to those goals? And again, if we're not getting results, and this is the other reason we sometimes have this lack of trust, how do we create an environment where the superintendent's not deathly afraid to give us the results? In Arizona, they talk about data being either a flashlight or a sledgehammer. And if we use the data as a sledgehammer all the time, we're not going to get the true results and understand where the needs are. We have to create this environment where the superintendent and his or her staff is comfortable saying, I got to tell you some bad news tonight, because we're never going to fix the reading scores or the math scores or how the kids are reacting to all this tension and pressure that in the world right now, unless we talk about social emotional learning. So, we have to create that environment where all of that is comfortable and done effectively. Otherwise, we can't get to that higher level. I saw a lot of sort of connections between this and that triangle that or the pyramid that we showed earlier, in terms of how do you create that highest level of governance unless you have clearly this is kind of the roadmap to get to that.
And it ultimately leads to success. Right.
In fact, with some boards, if trust isn't the issue, but they're having trouble with results, I just break this out and talk about success instead of trust.
We might add that, in Vermont, several boards practice policy governance, some with great fidelity, some sort of loosely. But for a board that practices policy governance with fidelity, these things are really built into the structure. And that's where kind of the wheels come off if a step is missed. Like, clear vision without an action plan is just a dream at best.
That's
right? And then the results, and of course, we'll get to this, but the board's responsibility and monitoring progress to make sure the results are going the right direction. And Nick, it's so important what you just said. A board member or a board as a whole can only embarrass an administrator publicly once before things are not disclosed anymore. Like I've seen that happen where, somebody came along and administrators sharing data. This is how our students are doing. This is the progress we're making. And one board member goes, how could you let this happen? What are, into a rant. People shut down. Yep. And it often takes a board in a district a year or 2 or more to get back to that flashlight idea. Once it's used as a hammer, good luck getting that back. Because back to that condition for success, right? There's got to be a sense of trust, of openness, of the ability to talk about things without, kind of having your proverbial head cut off. Like,
I was with a board a couple Saturdays ago doing a retreat, and this topic comes up a lot, and especially because they were talking about data as part of it. And one board, it typically is one board will say, "I can't believe somebody would do that. Who would upset their administrators that much?" The superintendent said, "I've got administrators that come to me after a board meeting and they're upset, and they're like, how could that be? We're nice, but." And most of the time, this is unintentional. I guess that would be my advice to folks. Be mindful of how you say things. People aren't usually on attack mode, but it sometimes sounds like that. So just be cognizant of that. And unfortunately, when you have one that's doing it deliberately, that's a whole nother
Yeah, that's a
That's
whole
when you
other
call
problem,
Debbie and say, come on out and visit us.
right? It, as Debbie was talking earlier with the triangle, that there's the good governance, which is doing all the right things, but then there's the positive governance, which is doing all the right things with the right frame of mind, the right disposition, if you will, of kind of curiosity, openness, help me understand type of questions versus Renee, how could you let this happen? Like, right, this is just a whole that's the distinction between, governance and positive governance.
It's all about the relationship. It really is. Um, you're going to move on to three, I think, in a minute here, but there's a question already about number three. So I'm going to give you the question so that when you talk about number three, you might be able to answer the question at the same time. So this person's wondering if they could get examples of what boards are doing in highly effective schools or districts, and how are they holding their schools accountable for high achievement? It's a good question. So what would you say to that?
Well, and the missing piece so often is monitoring progress.
Mhm.
Again, for a district that follows policy governance with fidelity, that's just baked in. It'll happen every month. There's monitoring progress. But for a system that's not using policy governance or not using it well, the question becomes, when do we talk about how the students are doing? Like Nick said, every board meeting agenda should have report on goals. And one month it might be, well, we've done this or that, and it takes a minute or two. And another month, it might be a deeper dive, 45 to 50 minutes of discussion about a specific area of focus or improvement. But this occurred to me about a year ago, this idea that the simple act of monitoring student progress in board meetings can have tremendous impact on a school system and an impact for improving student outcomes. If you just think about the human element, forget any research-driven information studies, just the human element. Everybody wants to look good. Like it, every teacher, every principal, every superintendent, the board as a whole, people want to look good. And if they know that we're going to be looking at our students' reading assessment scores for the middle of the year, we're going to have that on our agenda in February. People know that's coming. Just the power of that goal and that little bit of pressure that's like everybody's going to see your numbers. Like so that just that act of knowing it's on the governance calendar, like we're going to talk about how our students are doing in reading. We're going to do that in February. We'll have some data to share. We're going to talk about how our students are doing in math or science or writing. And we'll, that's on the calendar in March, April, May. People just knowing there's going to be a discussion coming up is a powerful lever for a school board to help support and drive improvement in a school system.
Another component, and Phil's going to smile when I bring this up, but one of the things we talk about in Lighthouse is reciprocity of accountability, which is a whole lot of syllables. An educator obviously came up with the term, but it equates to pressure and support. That we have equal responsibility to apply pressure, and that's by asking for the results, having those reports on the meetings, holding people accountable. But the other side of it is, what do we have to do as a board to support that? That you can't just let there be better math scores and expect the administration to do it all. That, what do you need from us to be successful? Is it better professional development? Is it new materials? Is it whatever it might, maybe we have to restructure when we teach it or whatever. But you can't just say, let there be light and then expect light to happen unless certain things happen along the way. And so the board has to acknowledge that we have a job to do as well that makes that happen.
Well, you can't tell
And
the superintendent, let there be light, and not give him the money to turn on the lights, right?
That's right.
Renee, jump in. Sorry.
And so I was just going to add that I also think it's critical to be comfortable in a school board member's skin and being able to ask questions. So if we present one point of data and say this is the way it is, please be comfortable and say, what support do you have for that point in time, that point of data? The other piece is if data is only being presented as a narrative and you're just hearing about the good things, that's fantastic. But that, again, is just a singular point. So be able to ask for, how do we know that this is actually taking place in the district? And how do we know that these successes and areas for improvement are happening to all students or in certain student groups and not just the students in an aggregate?
Those are really good points, Renee. And in a culture where there's high trust, again, that ability to be able to ask a question that, doesn't immediately put a superintendent on the defensive, but being able to ask the superintendent, what else do we need to know about this data? Or what is the data telling you? Again, there needs to be a conversation among the board and superintendent administrative team, not just sort of a static report, but what else might we need to know about? And let me just pick up on what Nick said too. Yeah, I don't like all those syllables, but that idea, if we're going to hold the superintendent and system accountable for something, are we doing our part to provide the support for them to be able to do those things? I loved this poignant moment. I was observing a superintendent evaluation one evening in Washington as part of my research there. And when they finished the evaluation, the board chair said, I just got to ask, is there anything we're doing as a board that's hindering you and your effectiveness at being a superintendent, improving student achievement? It was just this beautiful moment that, unfolded an opportunity for a conversation and for the superintendent even to say the next month with the board, I thought of something. And actually, when the board member was doing these kind of micro focus things, going into the schools, telling the teachers how they needed to teach, telling the principal how they needed to administrate. That was really interfering with my ability to help support their success in the school. That open conversation, again, trust, it really can't be overstated how important that is to all of this.
I'd like to jump in and share a story about something that happened at our board on Monday night. Renee, right? Renee presented us with his first monitoring report of our ends policy. It's an interim report since we're about halfway through the year. And at the end, it was a wonderful report. When he asked if there were any questions, nobody had any questions. Now, part of me thinks that part of that reason could be because we were also talking about the budget for the fiscal year 26, and our mind is more on that and how do we, help ensure that our budget gets passed. But also, I think oftentimes part of the challenge for board members is they don't know what questions to ask, right? And there's a real art in this in terms of school board governance, I believe. So Nick, I was wondering if you could walk us through this tool, which we can put up as a handout. This is a slide, obviously, so this isn't the tool itself, but I found this to be extremely helpful in looking at some of these sample board questions for boards to use when they're monitoring a progress report. Could you say something about that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, this was created by the Iowa School, I almost said Iowa School Boards Association as part of their Lighthouse work. And we added to it a little bit and embellished it, but they did the real lion's share of the work on it. So I wanted to sure they get the credit for it. But the idea is to sort of create a template for a presentation to the board so that when you've presented your new math program or a new, maybe it's a new building. I mean, it could be almost anything. There are certain questions we're always going to ask. So the intent would be that at some point, maybe during a retreat or as a separate issue, the board comes up with a discussion. Here's the 6 questions. Here's the 7 questions we always want answered anytime there's a proposal for something for us to vote on. What's it intended to improve? What goal is it aligned with? What's it going to take to do it well? What's the impact going to be? My favorite question is always, and I always tried to do this as a board member, but I didn't do it well back then. I'd hope to do it better if I get back on the board someday. How will we know if this is successful? In my mind, that's probably the most important question. And how are we going to know? So we're already building into the proposal how it's going to be reported back to us later. So there's no surprises. And my favorite, and it gets to what Renee was mentioning earlier, what other options were considered and why was this the one you chose to bring to us? You know, treat us, respect the fact that we're thinking, caring people, trust us to listen to you, maybe ask questions to push back a little just because we want to make sure it's done right. Um, on any board I've ever served on, whether it's the Board of Ed or some nonprofit boards, the executive directors get to know me pretty well because I always ask the question, if somebody's going to ask this question, it might as well be me. I'm not doing it to challenge you. I know you're going to have a good answer for it, but the question should be asked and answered before we vote. And so that tended to be my role. Some of them blanched when I walked in the room. Others really appreciated that. But so developing a tool like this, giving it to the superintendent is going to remove some of the questions that you'll always hear those questions. These questions will always get asked. Rather prepare it in your presentation, have it ready, and it'll just resolve a lot of issues before they become an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Debbie, I would encourage, there's two different pieces of this, but maybe the most important, when a board is reviewing data, like the question is, what data does the board need to see? That's number one. What data do we need to see? Number two, and this is more important than what people realize sometimes, what format do we need to see it in? Like, do we need a line graph, a bar graph? Do we need a chart? What would help us as lay citizen board members understand the data and ask good questions? The follow-up to that is, what data do we need to see? What format do we need to see it in? What questions might we ask based on this data? Let's not just look at data for the sake of looking at data, but let's identify in advance. And a tool like this can help immensely. And I'm sure Renee will appreciate when the administration knows that they can anticipate a certain type of question, right? Then it's a conversation. Nobody's embarrassed. There's no surprises. It's not a gotcha. But the board has to be sort of pre-thought in advance. Well, what questions are we going to ask about this data? And like Renee was saying, subpopulations, different groups, how are our English language learners doing? How are our special ed students? Like, what are the questions that the board might ask? I think it's also really important, particularly for the board to be engaged in helping drive improvement. What decisions, if any, are governance level decisions based on this data? Again, having those thoughts in advance and a discussion as a board superintendent team, it gets to the why are we looking at this data, and it makes it actually something that can help push improvement in the system.
That's a good segue to a question that popped up a little bit ago, Phil, about what happens, like if you're getting a report, you're getting your reports, but this board is not happy with what they're seeing in terms of student outcomes, scores, for example. What can they do as a board using this governance role, right? How do highly successful or effective districts approach this when they're not happy with the results that they're seeing?
In an ideal world, you've built a conversational element of culture of trust, if you will. And if the board member is not happy, and particularly the board as a whole, but if the board member is not happy with the results they're saying, there's a way to say that without a lot of drama. Like, these results don't seem like what we've been looking for, hoping for, expecting. Can you tell us more about that? Or what is the district or the school doing to improve performance in this area? Like, right, not letting it be unspoken or untouched. I think if there's, performance issue over time, that becomes part of the superintendent evaluation. And ultimately, the board owes it to the community and frankly to the superintendent as well, to hold the system accountable for improvement. So I think, you could parse out, there's sort of the open public meeting conversation. There may be some one-on-one conversation, and there may be part of an evaluation conversation.
And Phil talked a little bit before about, if we're regularly having reports and using this tool, again, the question might be, how are we going to know whether it's being successful or not? It shouldn't be a surprise, 6 months or a year into the program, we're not doing so well, that if we know we have a problem area and it's something the board has addressed through a new program or supporting a new initiative, we should be getting the trouble areas should be regularly reported on, not necessarily in detail, but we're continuing to monitor this. Here's an area that we've started to see some improvement, or we now know we need to provide a little more professional development. Getting the board to acknowledge it's not just the superintendent's problem until it comes to us 6 months from now, but it's always both our problem. And so that there's again, it's not playing gotcha. We're here together to solve this problem. The solution wasn't to initiate something and make it successful, it's to improve student learning. And so it's okay if we buy a new curriculum or we develop it or go down a new path, and fully understanding that if we do everything right, maybe we get the results, but it's getting us in the right direction and we make mid-course corrections. And so it's okay not to be successful as much as if we haven't reached our goal, as long as it's never not our goal. We just keep moving and we allow for adjustments, give the superintendent and staff enough confidence to say, you know what, this isn't really kind of working the way we want it to. We're going to bring an expert in to work with the staff, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that to help make it happen the way we all want it to be.
So here's a follow-up question to that, Nick, because what you mentioned, those possible solutions are good ones. They all, however, require money. So here's a question. Renee, I think you might want to take this one. What if your district is already a high spending district and your academic outcomes aren't so great? Is the only board action to add more spending in conjunction with high expectations and database goals? Our budgets are already barely passing, sometimes on second votes. So what else could be? Do you want to take that, Renee?
Sure. Can you go back to the trust equation slide with the one that finishes with success, please?
Yep.
So I would say in response to that question, the first two components are missing, or at least they are definitely not aligned to what you're hoping that the results are going to be. Because you have results, the results are not satisfactory, and you're spending a lot of money to get those results that you don't really like. So what I would say is that you need to have a clear vision. So whether that comes from the board or in collaboration with the superintendent, that clear vision needs to be in place. Then the board has its action plan to monitor the action plan that's created by the administration in order to achieve those results. And so it's absolutely critical that if something is being done over and over and over and over again, and you're getting the same results, that is not leading you to get to where you need to be. So in the situation where you want different results, but not have to spend additional money, you might have to spend a little bit more money, but you'll have to look at our staffing, looking where our people are spending their time, look at how the budget is allocated, because it could mean that there's additional supports that teachers need. There's additional supports that the students need, and you need to figure out a way how you can build that action plan that supports the superintendent and the administration, and then making sure that the administration is actually supporting the teachers and the students along the way. And it is going to boil down to progress monitoring as well. So until you have what you really want as results, having these interim reports are going to be incredibly valuable.
I could give you a real world example of how this could come, a way of dealing with this. I had been at a conference and one of the presenters talked about, if you have 9 board members with 9 interpretations of what the problem is, you're never going to get a solution that's going to solve the problem. And that stuck with me. And so I was called in by a superintendent and board chair to work with their board. They had been trying to initiate all-day kindergarten for about 10 years. This was probably about 15, 20 years ago when we were going through this, but that was a big deal back then. And every year the town kept saying, we can't afford it. Drop it, because it's double the price of kindergarten, basically. So they were getting frustrated because they weren't doing anything. They were stalled. And so the superintendent did a 2-phase thing. I met with the district administrators, there were about 17 of them. And I said, we're not going to talk about solutions today. We're only going to try to agree on what the problem is and then bring it to the board to try to work on some goals together. And I opened the floor, and the first person raised a hand and said, the problem is we need all-day kindergarten. I said, that's a solution. What's the problem? Well, we need more time. That's a solution. That's a solution. What's the problem? It took us about an hour, took them about an hour, but they finally came up with literacy and numeracy, that the math scores in reading and writing were not at a point where they could do anything else. So they went to the board and they shared that with them. And the board said, okay, we're going to stop fighting over all-day kindergarten, but we're going to start doing reading initiatives and math initiatives. So they were spending far less money than they would have to implement all-day kindergarten, and maybe gotten different results, but maybe not, because even kindergarten wasn't going to focus on necessarily on what the problems were. They started immediately with reading initiatives, math initiatives, and they started raising test scores. So that was an example where they kind of stalled themselves. And so it's like reevaluating what is the problem we're really trying to address. Maybe you can reprioritize a couple other things so that you don't have to spend as much on them and focus on the other work.
I love that example, Nick. I mean, that's so powerful. And I'm just going to suggest, I've never had this thought before, but we serve on a school board not to solve problems, but to define problems, right? Like we're not there as the educational experts to tell the superintendent and others, here's the thing we got to do. It's got to be this, it's got to be that, it's got to be this curriculum, that, whatever the pet project, which there's no end to those. We're there to say, Mr. Superintendent, in this case, Mr. Sanchez, we want you to improve reading and math. Tell us how you're going to do that. What do we need to do as a board to support you making that happen?
Well, the same thing kind of happened with me on my board, because they kept proposing all-day kindergarten, and I kept saying, what's it going to do? We'll just start, and then we'll figure it out. No. I was a little bit fiscally conservative, and I just said, if you can show me how this is going to benefit the kids, I'll be 100% behind it. But I can't do that until. And in fact, it took a while for us to, I didn't win that vote. They did implement it, but we struggled for several years with results not really in place until they really sat down and said, what are we going to do with this to make it better? But it had to still be meaningful, but you had to ask, that's the question a school board member asked. What will this do to help the children? Show me and I can support it. And until we had that, it was very difficult for me to support it. And then once we had it and it was going well, the town tried to cut the money out of it. And that's when I fought back for a change. Well, you were always against it. Well, not anymore.
So a question came up about that it kind of goes back, it does go back to the provision of reports to the board and questions that the board could ask. So this board member says that if the board had had the opportunity to read through the information in advance, they might have had the chance to formulate appropriate questions. And that is a challenge. I have to say that I hear, you probably do too when you travel your states, or a frustration that boards have, that they often aren't getting the information they need in enough time to read through carefully, process that information, and come up with some questions if they have any, right? And I'm one of those people. I cannot read on the fly. I can't chair a meeting, look at information, and let alone formulate some questions to ask. So I know that kind of falls on the superintendent to ensure that materials are shared ahead of time. In the board packet whenever possible. We have to get ours out there, I think 72 hours in advance. So that should be enough time, but sometimes reports just aren't ready, or a budget just might not be ready. Any advice anybody on this panel has about how we can do a better job with that?
Well, the one thing I'd say is the alternative to that is death by PowerPoint. We're going to show you 37 slides with a bunch of charts and graphs and numbers, and you're not going to understand any of it. And then it's really hard to ask questions, or you're asking questions that could have been answered, as you said. If I had the data in front of me, it might help. So I think there's got to be a balance. Budget might be hard because you're cracking the numbers right up till the end, especially during hard times. But whatever we're going to give you, the presentation at the board meeting is that 5-minute synopsis. Don't try to give us all that data Especially if you don't want pushback, because it can get very frustrating. My first superintendent liked to play that game. He'd bury us with data and expect us to just vote for whatever it was. And so a lot of times we weren't necessarily back to trust. I mean, it's very hard to trust once you've done that a couple times and start seeing things slipping through the cracks, or maybe didn't turn out the way you thought they were going to be. But some of it, I think you just have to provide the resources, because we did some research on this because we're going into electronic agendas and stuff. Preparing for board meetings is an incredible amount of work, especially I'm sure in your small Vermont districts, like small Connecticut districts. Central office stops dead for a week while we're getting the materials together. When it was paper, it was a lot harder, I think, in some ways. You had the big accordion folders, you kept putting the packets together manually. But there's all this work that goes into preparing for a meeting. But part of that means, how do we get that data done in a way? You know, some boards say we have to have the packet at least the Thursday before a Tuesday meeting. And if you can't do that, then there better be a good explanation why. And sometimes there is, but there you have to create that culture. Back to this sort of equation. What components do we have that allow for us to be a better board, or that positive governance level is we work together to be prepared. And that does mean sometimes getting that report sooner, maybe not in a way that's easily digestible, and that might frustrate some people, but you can't have it both ways. You either get it or you don't.
These are items that need to go into a board operating protocol.
Yep.
And, you know, a board member should never vote on something that they don't understand or haven't had ample opportunity to research, understand the material. They either need to vote no or abstain or make a motion to table it to a future meeting. And I realize a lot of things will come up over time, but if the board is intentional with a board governance calendar, these are the things we're going to talk about these months. You know, it helps a lot, that central office staff, to be able to funnel things into the right month and be more prepared for the board meetings. Debbie, I think in today's times, it's really essential to pick up on this idea of building public will.
Yes.
We mentioned that as a role, and this is so critical. In the Lighthouse Project, Nick and I and everybody that ever worked with Mary Delegardelle, everybody loved Mary. Mary was so committed to the community's role in public education, and she was so committed to that being a part of the board's responsibility that she just hung on to it. But it was the one thing she could never prove statistically. There are just too many variables. What did the board actually do to engage the community? And over the last few years, we've had some research emerge. A study that I commissioned in Texas showed a strong connection when boards were involving the community in the board's work. They were more likely to be overseeing a system that was improving in achievement overall and closing gaps. So at the extent to which the board can involve the community in the board's work of a collaboratively developed clear vision, collaboratively developed clear goals, having those conversations, having work studies, community forums, opportunities for input, it can't usually happen in the typical constraints of a regular board meeting. The board has to be very intentional about bringing in students, staff, community members for community conversations. What are our values and our vision for our schools? When boards do that, not only is student achievement more likely to be improving, but support for budgets is more likely to be happening as well. Like all the things that we would want from the community, people are not up on what they're not in on. So how do we as a board ensure they're in on some of that governance work?
Such a good point, and important that you make, Phil, because whenever we talk about creating the vision for your district, or in the case of a policy governance district, creating that ends policy, that is critical, that you have engagement with your owners if you're a policy governance board, and community engagement for a traditional board, that you invite the community to participate in the creation of that statement, whether it's an end statement or a vision statement, because that will not only make the statement better and stronger and more representative of your community and their values and what's priorities to them. But it'll also buy that buy-in that is so critical, like you said, so that when we go and we say, here's how much money we're asking you to pay taxpayers, they're more apt to support the budget, knowing that they were part of creating that statement. So I think that's really important. And I like what you just said. And I have a feeling you're going to be saying that again this afternoon around 2:00.
Yeah, well, there's so much to that. The public
Yeah.
support for improving, as you said, it's their schools, regardless of governance structure, the community owns the schools. So we're just stewards of the community schools. Has to be their vision, has to be their values, or it's not sustainable.
Mhm.
So
Let's make sure we hit that number 5 there. Learning together as a team. That was kind of a serendipitous finding out of the Lighthouse study. It wasn't something anyone sought out to prove. It's just a fact. When boards and superintendents learn together as a team, student achievement is probably improving, right? And so we can't overstate how important that is. It's great to have a few dozen people on this webinar today, Debbie, but way more powerful than individuals engaging in learning is the team engaging in learning together. Perhaps with you, perhaps listening to a recording of something like this or going through a book study. The team has to learn, or student achievement's not going to be improving.
Mhm. Yeah, we do some of that, right, Renee?
Yes, we do. On a regular
Yeah.
basis, on a regular basis.
Yeah, we call it part of our governance investment policy, where we want to ensure that there are resources put aside in terms of time or money, where the board has that opportunity to really dig into learning its role, understanding its role with the superintendent, because we consider the superintendent part of our governance team. So yeah, I think that's really, there's money well invested when a board spends a little bit of money on learning together as a board team with the superintendent. So I want to respect people's time. And I just looked it down at my phone. I cannot believe it's 1:00. I don't know where the hour went. I swear this was so enjoyable for me personally. And I hope for those of you who tuned in, we have a couple of tools that we didn't get to, like this planner, the 5-column organizer, for the 5 roles of school board. And we did touch on all those 5 roles. So these are types of things that I will ensure are handouts and on our website so that everybody has access to these. And before we close, I just wanted to let those of you know how to contact me if you have any follow-up questions. And also, I cannot close before I give a profuse thank you to Phil, Renee, and Nick for their time today and sharing their many years of experience and knowledge with all of us. I loved what we talked about today. I wish we had another hour because I have a feeling we could have kept going, but I know we all have jobs to do. So I won't keep you anymore, but thank you very much, Nick, Renee, and Phil, for all of your time and help with this webinar today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks for having us be a
Thank
part
you.
of it.
It was a pleasure.
It was
You're
great.
very
Thank you.
welcome.